All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Anne Wagner of Ryerson University in Toronto, who's going to talk about MDMA and cognitive therapy in post-traumatic stress disorder. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you for joining me here this afternoon. So I am going to give a little bit of context to this work as we get going in it, because the majority of work that you may have heard about involving MDMA for the treatment of PTSD is not this work. This is the next kind of generation of studies that are happening with MDMA in the treatment of PTSD. So first of all, so my title here, very long, is MDMA plus Cognitive Behavioral Conjoint Therapy for PTSD, and MDMA plus Cognitive Processing Therapy for PTSD, results and developments. So I'm going to unpack what all of those things are as we go along. And I want to acknowledge 3 different groups as I get going that are shown here on the screen. So the first is my academic institution, Ryerson University, who has gone along with this idea and this research. They've been supportive. MAPS, who are our funders, and Remedy, which is my practice where we'll be running, in collaboration with Ryerson and MAPS, the next study. Okay, so the team for this work includes myself, Candice Monson, who is a treatment development researcher in PTSD. And so Candice has been my mentor for close to a decade now. And Candice's approach and my approach, we come at this very much from a PTSD treatment development perspective. So before we started doing this work, neither of us had anything to do with psychedelic research. We weren't particularly, we were agnostic as to what it looked like. And the reason we got into this was simply because of an invitation from MAPS, from Michael and Annie. So Michael Mithofer and Annie Mithofer, so you would have seen in the last, in Torsten's talk about the results from Michael and Annie's phase 2 studies. So they have been spearheading the MDMA for the treatment of PTSD research for the past 15-ish years. And so we were very lucky to have the experience of collaborating and developing this idea together. And the idea really being of what would it look like if we combined what is currently being used, or one of the treatments that is currently being disseminated fairly widely in North America for the treatment of PTSD, and that shows quite promising results on its own. So in the treatments I'm going to be talking about, these are considered at the moment the frontline treatments for PTSD on their own without MDMA. And so the idea being that if we combine these things together, what would that look like? Would we get even better results? Would we potentially see gains in other areas? In mechanistically, what is it about potentially these different psychotherapies that might have different impact than each other? So that was a big thing we wanted to take a look at. I also had no idea when I started doing this work, the realm of psychedelic work that we were entering into. I thought we were on a little island doing this neat little study, and then I went to Psychedelic Science, this conference in Oakland, and got to see that there were thousands of other people who were interested in this work. So it's been a real journey for me and really exciting, especially someone who is a PTSD researcher and is now combining these things together. Okay, so to orient you a little bit as to what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start by talking about PTSD, because I think that's actually very important for us to understand why we would even be thinking about combining things together. Then I'm going to be talking about the treatments that currently exist for PTSD. I'll talk very briefly about MDMA. I am not a pharmacologist, so this is going to be layperson's version talking about MDMA. And then I'll talk about MDMA as an adjunct to 3 different therapies. And specifically, I say adjunct here because really it started with the idea of combining these 2 particular views together, and is now changing into something a little bit different. It's the integration of these things together is kind of creating its own protocol. I'll go into detail about CBCT, which is the couples study with MDMA, and that's one where I'll show you results from our pilot, and then talk to you theoretically about what we're doing next with CPT. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder is specifically when a traumatic stressor occurs. So first of all, something has to happen. This is unusual comparatively to every other psychiatric or psychological illness, is something happens. So there is a point in time in which something occurs or occurs over a length of time. So the traumatic stressor occurs, and then one thing that could happen afterwards is the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what that looks like is a combination of different symptom clusters. So to have PTSD, you need to have symptoms in each of these different clusters. The first being re-experiencing. So what that looks like pragmatically is it's people having thoughts and memories that are coming in again and again, unbidden. They don't want them there. They're not being recollected. They're not choosing to think about these thoughts. They're popping up into their minds. The re-experiencing can also look, for example, like nightmares, dreams that have to do with the experience. And then there's a symptom cluster of avoidance. It's really closely related to re-experiencing. So it makes lots and lots of sense. When you have experienced a traumatic event, you do not want to think or go back or do anything related to the traumatic event. You want to avoid things that remind you about it. You might be wanting to avoid internal experiences. You might be wanting to avoid external things too. People, places, things. The internal experiences are an interesting one when people are trying to avoid, because they can be trying to avoid emotion, they can be trying to avoid physical sensations, and people are oftentimes not aware of the fact that they're actually trying to avoid the internal sensations. The external ones are a little bit easier to pick out. You can recognize that, yes, I don't want to talk about this. Yes, I don't want to go to that place. I don't want to do this thing. I once heard this description that there are as many ways to avoid as there are people in the world, and I think that's very true. It never looks quite the same. There might be, it's very idiosyncratic to each person of what it might look like, their avoidance. The third symptom cluster is negative thoughts and feelings. Now, you might think negative thoughts and feelings, isn't that in many disorders? Yes, it is, but specifically when it comes to trauma, there are some highlights here. So particularly shame and guilt are biggies that we'll often see and oftentimes are tried to be targeted in treatment, and that's a challenge. Negative thoughts and feelings can be about oneself, the world, other people. And they're very persistent. They stay around. They're not fleeting. And then the fourth one is changes in arousal and reactivity. So that means, for example, you might become very activated. It's often expressed in terms of irritability and anger. It can be a hypervigilance, so a watchfulness of things around you. It can also be a big startle response. And so when you think about the classic description of what's going on with the traumatic stressors, you have an activation of the fight, flight, freeze response. Then this reactivity is a continual elevation of that fight, flight, freeze response that's going on. So in a nutshell, that's PTSD. So the types of treatment for PTSD focus in on these different symptom clusters. I kind of use them as different entry points. So exposure treatments tend to be ones that go over and over the traumatic event. And so they're trying to inoculate you to the fear or distress that that memory causes. They can be very effective, exposure treatments. The problem is getting people to do them, and for good reason. We don't want to go back there. We don't want to go back to the things that distress us. So one of the biggest issues there is the fact that of people not starting the treatment or dropping out of the treatment when it gets going. Cognitive treatments are ones that more specifically focus on meaning making. So they're focusing on that cluster of symptoms that's around cognitions and emotions. And so this one, you're trying to make sense of what has happened, how it makes sense in your life, and introduce shades of gray into thinking in ways that would be otherwise really, really rigid. There is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR, which is a treatment that's used. There's somatic treatments, including neurofeedback, and there's emerging evidence for some of these approaches. There's also things that we'll use for symptom management, and so that's to more control things in the moment, but doesn't necessarily get at the root cause of the treatment. So for example, seeking safety is an example of a symptom management program. And there's complementary treatments as well that go alongside and help with symptoms. So art therapy, yoga can be very useful in certain regards. So all these different types of treatments can be delivered individually, couples formats for some of them, and group formats for some of them. So right now, in the current state of our literature, our science, and I say this with a big caveat, so far, the most evidence we have are for exposure treatments and cognitive treatments. Prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy being the two that have had the most studies done on them and have shown the best results to date. I say that with a grain of salt because that's simply because these are the ones that had compared to some of the other ones I just mentioned, they do have the best results, but as we know, we're about to talk about something else, that there might be other treatments out there. So what do we need to work on? So first of all, these treatments do not work for everyone. That's very important. In our best clinical trials, these treatments only work for 50 to 60% of people, and that's in very controlled conditions with highly skilled therapists who are doing it in clinical trials. You take that out into the world, and your results will go down. So, I mean, it is better than where we were, 35 years ago when PTSD was really seen as a palliative condition, that there was no actual treatment, there was no cure for PTSD. And so we've changed a lot, but there's still a big gap to go in terms of care. We also want to create options and choice for folks. So for example, some folks do not want to do exposure therapy. Some people don't want to do cognitive therapy. So to be able to create option and choice in terms of what is available and what works is essential. And also, we really don't know the answers to the questions for whom, why, and when does something work. And so these are mechanistic questions that we ask ourselves in psychotherapy research all of the time, as for whom, why, and when does it work? And this we really need to understand better. And also, this is a big one, can healing be even more profound? And so when we hear that something works, it's usually that there's a big drop in symptoms. But that big drop in symptoms doesn't necessarily mean that the person is symptom-free. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all gone. It means that there's a statistically significant drop in where they started to where they ended. So I think if we're thinking about actually getting the fewest symptoms possible, the most healing possible, that's a big thing we can be striving for. Can there also be gains in other domains? So in other areas of functioning, in other areas of that person's life, and also for other people. Because what's really interesting and important is that PTSD does not exist in a vacuum. It is really within family systems, it's been within community. When someone's experienced a traumatic event and it's impacted them, it impacts everyone around them as well. And so it's important that, when we're thinking about addressing these concerns, we're not only thinking in an individual level, we're thinking contextually and within the system as well. So, coming to MDMA, probably why we're excited to be here, yay. All right, so MDMA is 3,4-methylene-dioxymethamphetamine, is a monoamine releaser. Its largest effects are on serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and also has increases, as we've heard, in serum oxytocin, vasopressin, cortisol, and many others. So this really is the layperson's version. That's all I'm going to say on MDMA. But MDMA has traditionally been combined with non-directive supportive psychotherapy for PTSD. Now, I say that, meaning that there is a protocol that exists. So, for example, all the phase 3 studies that are happening, that are going across North America and Israel, that they're using a manual, but that manual encourages you to use your best clinical skills. And so that's coming from a perspective of it's not necessarily a protocol of you do this type of intervention, you do this approach. And so that's, it's very useful, and it's demonstrating large effect sizes in what they've done in phase 2 studies, and we anticipate in phase 3 as well. But it is a different therapeutic approach than using a different protocol or modality. And so MDMA for the treatment of PTSD as a whole, like as a pharmacologic agent, has received breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA in the United States, which makes it a lot easier to have conversations with regulatory agencies in terms of doing the work. And the past studies and the current multi-site study have been proof of concept and drug development studies. And that's very, very important if we're thinking about bringing MDMA into use as a medication. And so what we're doing here is we're going a little bit this direction and trying to actually now look at the psychotherapeutic pieces of what's going alongside the use of MDMA. So with the psychological effects of MDMA, and I'm highlighting these in particular because it's going to make sense when I start talking about the therapies that we've chosen to use with them, is we're thinking about the acceptance of self and others and the increase in empathy, a tolerance of emotionally upsetting materials, and the ability to address upsetting material without extreme disorientation. And so the ability to do that when you're working with PTSD is highly attractive, right? And especially as we're starting to think about using it within a couple's context. So to be able to sit with distressing information and feel empathy is something that, for example, these couples that we've been working with have not been able to do for a very long time, if ever. Also, we have this idea of, I coined the term and, was talking about like this ease of cognition, that there is a very quick reaching to a thought process, and particularly I find with PTSD, those thoughts can often get convoluted and very rigid around particular ways of thinking. And with the use of MDMA, there's sometimes a bit more flexibility and an ease in which that flexibility occurs in that line of thought. There's potentially a decentering or changed relationship to thoughts and memories. And we've seen from a paper published by Mark Wagner and colleagues, increased openness to experience with the use of MDMA in PTSD treatment, which is really interesting because that's typically a state we consider personality constructs like openness to experience to be stable and that they wouldn't change with intervention. And to the fact that this changed with intervention in the phase 2 trials of MDMA is very interesting. And so MDMA was used as an adjunct to psychotherapy until 1985, when it became scheduled in North America and in other places in the world. And it predominantly was used for relationship distress, PTSD, and anxiety. And I mean, it was used for lots of different reasons, but these really stick out as being ones for which it seemed well suited for. Okay, so why would we, if we're seeing good results with these phase 2 studies, we're moving on to phase 3, why would we want to try another treatment with MDMA? I guess ask this question a lot, and I find particularly, coming from a background of treatment development research and like a heavily CBT, cognitive behavioral background, I often get asked the question, why on earth would we put together a cognitive behavioral treatment with MDMA? Those seem like they would not fit. And so I'm here to say that that's not necessarily the case, and mostly because I think that there's a misconception about the idea of what a cognitive behavioral therapy is. And it's true, you can have a protocol and it can feel really stiff from the delivery of a clinician. But I really want to emphasize that's the delivery of the clinician. It's not actually the protocol. And so what it's offering you is simply a template, like every other treatment that's out there, that this is a potential way to structure how we're going to go through this work together. And so it looks really different every time because you're bringing in the content of that person's life and experience. So it is completely tailored to the individual in terms of what they're going through. And what we were thinking is potentially when we're combining it with MDMA and we're thinking about this idea of preparation and integration of these experiences, to have a framework, to have a scaffold on which to be able to talk about, work with these different experiences might be very helpful, and that we'll be checking in on these different areas that we know, through lots of research are specifically indicated around PTSD. So themes like trust, control, intimacy, power, esteem. So these are all aspects within the therapy that we get at and we check in around. And so it's not, we're not saying you have to deal with this thing. It's more like, how is this thing for you? What does it look like for you? Should we go into that area? So the structure around that was part of the idea. So if we test the concept out, what would it look like? Would it maybe be better? Would it not? Would we have different types of gains? Also the idea that these are the treatments that are already widely disseminated in North America in particular, and in the US in particular. I'm Canadian, and it's been interesting trying to do this work, cross-countryed, and trying to understand the systems that are at place there. And actually in Canada, we're even further behind in terms of our dissemination of PTSD treatments. So, but the idea that these are ones that are already in healthcare systems lends actually a lens of, oh, that's interesting. You're going to add MDMA to the thing I already do. Okay, what might that look like? So that's created some very interesting and fruitful conversations, actually. And also what we're doing within these is addressing some concerns with current psychedelic and pathogen-assisted psychotherapy. And we're doing this, on a minor scale, but for example, one thing that we're doing is that we don't require a male-female therapist team. And so we have used, sometimes it's male-female, and other times it's been female-female, and that's simply because of the makeup of our clinician team. And so taking away that variable has been something that's been interesting, and thus far, I would say we've had great results doing that. So moving us into what these 3 pilot trials are. So there's actually 3 pilot trials. There's one with prolonged exposure. So this is the exposure-based treatment. And Dr. Barbara Rothbaum and her team at Emory University are going to be leading this study. We've finished, and I'll be presenting on cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. So this is a couples therapy for PTSD. And we ran that out of Charleston, South Carolina. And we're going to be running in Toronto in 2019 cognitive processing therapy plus MDMA. So the idea is that we have these 3 treatments that are already disseminated. Let's get pilot data on each and then go from there and see what it looks like. So this is CBCT for PTSD in a very, very short way. So typically this is like a 2-day training in CBCT, so I'm going to do it in 2 minutes. So CBCT is a 3-phase treatment. It typically takes 15 sessions to do, and they're 75 minutes long. And we would do this usually weekly, sometimes bi-weekly at the beginning. And the phase 1 is psychoeducation about PTSD. So you're learning about how PTSD runs in that system. What does it look like for you? How's it impacting your relationship? And you're creating safety for the couple. And that is really important, especially when you're about to enter into traumatic information. The idea that tempers will flare, that people's anger will get high is very likely. So we do a lot around what does anger look like? How do you deal with it? How do we work with it together? And what's interesting in this treatment, unlike a lot of other couples treatments, actually, is that we treat not the person with PTSD, we're treating the relationship. So the relationship is actually our client as opposed to the person with PTSD. And that really changes the tone in the room because that means then that both people are equally engaged in the treatment and they're both working on their own thoughts, their own behaviors, how they interact in that system. It's really important for engagement. And also to not have the person with PTSD feel like, oh, hey, I'm the person in treatment here and everyone's just here looking at me and trying to make me feel better. It's a major shift in mindset, I think, for a lot of partners to actually be like, whoa, I'm in treatment too, okay. But it works quite well. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is relationship enhancement and reducing avoidance. So we're doing a lot of work here to try to infuse some good into the relationship. There's a lot of distress that's often there, and reducing avoidance. And so what that looks like, we don't go over and over the memory in this treatment. Instead, we approach things that the couple's usually avoiding. And so that might be they're avoiding emotional information. They might be avoiding activities together. They might be avoiding all kinds of things. But we're getting them to do things together that they would normally avoid. And then phase 3, we move to challenging thoughts. And those are the thematic things I just talked about. So things that have to do are common within PTSD, we check in around and we challenge them for both members of the dyad, because what can be really impactful is when one person is actually keeping the other person stuck. And so to be able to work through that accommodation together is very, very useful and important. So with the CBCT MDMA approach, we're creating a safe and mutually understood framework to do this work. And we're giving some skills and tools that are super practical to be able to have the preparation and integration conversations together and to do the work of getting rid of PTSD. And we allow for whatever comes up in the MDMA sessions. And this was a big question mark initially. We're thinking, like, do we actually do CBT while folks are taking MDMA? And then we decided, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, we prime them right before the MDMA session. So we will do some CBT in the morning beforehand, and they had a full dose of it the day before. And so then that evening, or not that evening, the day when they're taking MDMA, they're not getting any new content. They are practicing what they've learned before, but simply as a tool to assist in the experience of whatever comes up for them. And then we integrate through the use of the skills and tools after. And as I mentioned, we're really trying to create a scaffold to tether the experience to. So our study design for CBCT for PTSD, excuse me, was we were originally going to do 10 dyads, and we stopped at 6. And the reason for that was twofold. One, our results were really strong, so we decided to stop. And the second is it's quite time intensive, and we wanted to then move on to our next pilot and save some of the money. So that was important. But the main reason is because the results were very strong. So both participants in their MDMA sessions, of which there were 2 in this treatment, the first session, they both received 75 milligrams of MDMA. And then an hour and a half, they could receive a supplemental half dose of that original amount. The second session, they could choose to either be 75 or 100 milligrams as their starting dose. And we would encourage them to go up to 100 unless they had any particular concern. If I recall correctly, I think everybody went up to 100. And then there's an optional supplemental half of that dose, the first dose they took in the second session. So our primary and secondary outcomes, we were looking predominantly at PTSD as our outcome, but we were also looking at relationship satisfaction. We wanted to know what was happening there. We looked at a whole host of other things too, but these were our main two outcomes, and so I'm just going to be talking about those today. And so we assess PTSD in several different ways. We do clinician-rated assessment of the CAPS-5, which I'm not presenting today. We're doing the PCL, which is both the person with PTSD and their partner are rating the person's PTSD symptoms. And this is a really interesting measure to see how it's reflected and how it's being communicated about in the relationship. And then the relationship satisfaction is rated by the person with PTSD and their partner. So this is what the protocol flow looks like. So the stars here are our assessment time points. And so we had baseline, mid-treatment, 1 month, 3 month, and 6 month. 1 month is considered our end of treatment, our post-treatment assessment. We had 2 preparatory visits, and these visits are specifically around informed consent, questions about the protocol, questions about the logistics, and getting to know the therapists. I say that with a grain of salt. It was only 1 therapist who did the preparatory session, so it wasn't actually, deemed a therapy visit. Then we did in-person CBCT. So in those in-person CBCT sessions, we condensed down the protocol and did several sessions in 1 day. So we would do 3 sessions of CBCT squished into 1 day. The next morning, we would do sessions 4 and 5. And sessions 4 and 5 are the communication skills. So that was the priming right before the MDMA session. Then we would have the MDMA session that would last the length of the day. They would stay over with a night attendant, and we'd come back the next day for integration. And what our integration looked like, we left it open to talk about whatever came up in the session, and then we would transition back into the CBCT protocol by talking about how they were going to then take this out of session and do out of session assignments. And so they would have, for example, be doing communication tasks together and approaching different things over the coming weeks. And then we would do 4 CBCT sessions, like regular length psychotherapy sessions, between the MDMA sessions. We did it says telehealth here. The reason for that was pragmatic. I live in Toronto. The site was in South Carolina. I didn't move there full time, so we did it over telehealth. We did a mid-treatment assessment, and then we did in-person CBCT for 2 sessions, MDMA session, integration, and finished out the protocol. So the whole thing took about 2 months to complete for everybody. So what did our MDMA sessions look like? So in a lot of other talks we've heard this weekend, there's been photos and description of what psychedelic assisted sessions look like. Our MDMA sessions look very similar. So we have the perspective of we're inviting folks to spend time inside, so with their internal experiences. They are, in this study, they're on recliner chairs that can swivel and face each other for when the couple wants to talk to each other. And they have eye shades on and headphones with music. And we learned, as we went along in the study, to better coordinate conversation between the couple, because it's the empathic response is strong. And when someone is sharing about their traumatic experience that they have not talked about before with their partner, that partner is sitting right up and taking off their eye mask and wanting to know exactly what they have to say. So we learned to facilitate that everyone, trying to have enough time inside for both people, that they both had their fulsome experiences. What was interesting is we didn't direct what was talked about in those sessions. We didn't suggest that they go over the traumatic memory. We actually don't go over the traumatic memory at all in CBCT. We go over the impact of it. And in every case that we saw, this is anecdotally, the person would spontaneously start talking about their traumatic events and the content of the traumatic events, oftentimes in much greater detail than they had ever talked to their partners or anyone else about it before. So that was learning to coordinate when that disclosure would happen, but particularly more just to allow for a natural, not one person leading that session. We learned over time. So we allowed for whatever cognitive, emotional, and somatic material arose, and we were supporting the non-avoidance of embodied and experiential learning. And so that will come a little bit clearer in a quote that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. But the idea, if we think back to that one of the first slides about that idea of avoidance being so central to PTSD, and particularly that experiential avoidance of not wanting to feel, and it ends up going broader. There's often a numbness that comes alongside of it, that it's a lack of emotional experience in general. And so the idea that you could have the experience of being able to sit with your emotion and not being fearful of the emotion, even if it's a challenging one, is a very, very salient learning experience. And so that moment of getting to go like, oh, I get to experience my whole range of emotion, and I don't have to be scared of it. That learning experience is a very powerful one. So I'm going to show you some data. Yay, data. My scientist brain's like, whoo. Okay, so what do we have? We've got in our, oh, can I use my pointer? Yes, okay. So if you'll see first CBCT visit, so that's their first day in treatment. End of therapy was their last CBCT visit, and 6-month follow-up was 6-month follow-up. So PTSD plus means the person with PTSD is rating their symptoms. The partner is rating that person's PTSD symptoms, not their own. They don't have PTSD. And each person's relating their own relationship satisfaction. So to give you context, the PCL, this is the PCL-5, it can go from 0 to 80 is the highest number you can have on this PCL. And the relationship satisfaction from 0 to 6. 3 meaning happy. So 3 and above is a happy experience. Okay, so I'm going to take you through them. So this couple started, and first, the other thing I want you to pay attention to is how far apart these scores are. Part of our goal is to have them be closer together, which means they're communicating differently about the symptoms. So they started, this is kind of like moderate, not quite in the severe range of PTSD, reduced significantly and maintained at follow-up. And you'll see that they were in the unhappy range to start and had increasing relationship satisfaction over time. Okay, second couple, higher PTSD symptoms, big spread in terms of understanding of what was going on. Huge drop in their PTSD symptoms. So also to note that generally speaking, we think of about a 10-point drop on this scale as being clinically significant, meaning we would clinically say that there's a change, a big change. And so this one we're seeing over 40-point drop, and that's well below the cutoff of what we would think of as for PTSD. The cutoff, there isn't really a cutoff yet on this measure. It's still being decided, but it's high teen, or actually over 20. We think it's about 21, 22-ish is around the cutoff, but don't quote me on that one. It's about that. And then that was maintained at follow-up. They had relatively stable relationship satisfaction over time. The third couple, this couple, you'll notice were far apart in their symptoms, and it looks like they didn't improve. So anecdotally, though, what was interesting, and I think we'll look at some qualitative data around this, was this couple, the person with PTSD was extremely dissociative. And so dissociation is a symptom type within PTSD that is very challenging in terms of treatment outcomes. And so if folks are dissociative and highly dissociative, they tend to have slightly worse outcomes when they're going through PTSD treatment. And so what we noticed here, anecdotally, is that the dissociation improved a lot. This person was not dissociating as much. But when the dissociation goes away, it's a coping mechanism. And so when it goes away, the other symptoms are felt more. And so it doesn't mean they weren't there before, but the person's subjectively reporting that they're experiencing that more because the dissociation isn't there covering it up. So that's what we're guessing is going on here. And we did see it was relatively stable at 6-month follow-up. We heard that there wasn't a huge increase in dissociation as it went forward. And this person did pursue other psychotherapy afterwards. And they did have improvement in their relationship satisfaction. So then for our next 3 couples, we have a pretty stable pattern of massive drops and improvement in relationship satisfaction. and continued massive drops with increased relationship satisfaction, and again. So yeah, so that's what the results look like for that. And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. So these first quotes are from actually in the session. So I pulled them from my notes from within the session. And we asked at one point, this one participant in an MDMA session, asked the idea of like, what do you think it would be like if PTSD wasn't here right now? And the participant, thinking through it for a minute, was like, well, I know what it would feel like because PTSD isn't here right now. And he had not felt that way in his adult life. Another participant said in a session, I feel like the weight is lifted. We started unraveling the strings that had been in knots one at a time, and then the whole knot came undone. I feel different, and it feels great. I never imagined there could be this much healing. And a third participant in a session said, thank you for giving me my life back and helping us with our marriage. I just have overall inner peace. It's amazing. There's no price anyone can pay for that. So those are from a session. And then on the plane, on the way here, I landed in Stockholm and opened my email, and I got this email. And I checked in with the participant to see if it would be okay if I read it. This is unsolicited. I haven't heard from this participant in a couple of months. And so this participant had a little bit of a creep in symptoms at 6 months. I mean, not clinically significant, but a little bit. And so had gone to a therapist for a few sessions and just tried to talk through a few more memories. And he wanted to update us on what had happened. So the memories of that last year just poured out. It was hard to see and disturbing, but there was no pain or fear associated with them. Totally different than when we first met a little over a year ago. And this was to me and Michael Medhofer. Hard to believe it's been a year. My life is totally different now, and I wanted you to know how deeply grateful I am for what you guys are doing. No words or all the thank yous in the world could express my gratitude. I have my life back, and for the first time in my life, I look forward to a renewed future. I live my life now with hope where despair ruled before. That is a pretty huge realization for me. It's like a light has been shined into the darkness of my soul. Pretty cool. I was like, yes, that is pretty cool. Thank you. So we finished that study. Yay. My next dream is that one study from now is we'll hopefully be doing a randomized control trial of that, because my scientist brain is still saying, now, what would it actually look like if we're giving intensive therapy, lots of attention, like condensed over a short period of time, people are super bought in. The fact that we had no dropout from that study, no psychotherapy trial I know has no dropout from a study. There's something very, very bought in about these, this model of doing this work. So I would, to do an RCT of actually comparing what does it look like when you do CBCT alone versus CBCT plus MDMA, I think is very important, and thinking about it in a condensed format. So, and our next pilot study is combining CPT plus MDMA. So if you think of like the closest cousin therapy, or sibling really, to CBCT for individuals is CPT, same themes we're going after here. So we're going to use the same approach, and we're going to use 2 MDMA sessions. And CPT is a 12-session protocol, so it's actually a little bit easier even to place the MDMA sessions in there. And it really is targeting meaning-making about the traumatic event. And so it's individual delivery. And this is our likely design. 4 sessions, MDMA, 4 sessions, MDMA, 4 sessions. It just so happens that those sessions, equally divided, actually land in really excellent places within the protocol. You've just gone through kind of the initial narrative-ish construction of what's going on at the end of session 4, and then between sessions 8 and 9, you're really moving into the heart of the cognitive processing, like the restructuring and what's going on there. And that's what we did with CBCT as well. We strategically placed the sessions at points in the protocol where we thought they'd have the most influence. So the differences for this study, comparatively to CBCT, is that we're likely going to have one therapist delivering the treatment and having a support therapist within the MDMA sessions. So very like the study by Alicia Danforth and Charlie Grob, looking at MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety for autistic adults, they had the same model of there was one therapist delivering the protocol and then 2 therapists in the MDMA session. And then the individually delivered model is going to be closer, therefore, to the model that's currently happening in the phase 3 trial. So we'll be able to see a little bit more directly, I mean, it's not comparison, but we'll be able to look at results from the 2 to go, is there an added benefit of using a different therapy with the MDMA? And also, this is going to be our first investigator-sponsored study in Canada. And so we're going to be building capacity in Canada to be able to do more of this work, because as much as we're a liberal country, we haven't had a huge history of doing this recently. So it's exciting to be doing some more. So I thank you so much. I think we probably have time for some questions. And this is my contact information. And thank you so much. Great.
Thank you so much, Anne, for those very interesting data. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions. Please come up to the microphone.
And I have a question. You've showed the data from baseline numbers of PTSD and relationship quality and end results, but do you have like medium assessments of those punctuations, and have you seen where the results drop that dramatically?
Yeah, we do. So we actually took, the results I showed were the self-report measures. And we took that measure in every single time we had contact with the clients. So that means we have at least 18 data points that we can model over time with that. Anecdotally, there was a massive drop after the first MDMA session. In several clients, we did see drops before that, and you sometimes see that within the CBCT. As soon as you start talking about the traumatic experience and working on communication skills, you can start to see a drop in symptomatology sometimes. But I would say a lot of the drop, or the first big drop, I believe so far was after the MDMA session, and we'll see how it modeled over time, but it did continue to drop after that too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for an impressive presentation. I've just one question, and that's about the music. How was it selected? Was it standard for everyone, or did the people bring their own music? How was it done?
Thanks for that question. So Annie Mithofer was our DJ. She's excellent, and so it was not standardized. It was it was a standard, large repertoire of songs. We tried to start with a similar pattern, but it would shift and change. We occasionally would allow, sometimes people would bring music that they were interested in hearing. We would wait till near the end of the session and kind of when the experience was predominantly over to see if they would like some of it's kind of a grounding to see if they would be interested in bringing that in. For the next study, I've actually been having conversations with Mendel over here. Hopefully we're going to think about standardizing more, but within a module type way of the music, so we can have that variable a little bit more standard, but also working with, in a way, I don't have Annie's long history of working with music, so that'll be good to see.